folks, thanks so much for trying out our Ultimate Ink brush pack. Definitely our most ambitious one yet, and I hope you'll find loads of brushes in there that you'll love. We really wanted to create something that caters for a huge range of styles, so hopefully you'll be able to find the right tools. So the pack is split into 5 different sets just to make it easy for navigating. So we've got inkers, shaders, stroke patterns, fill patterns, and we've also got a handy little bonus toolbox that is filled with a few little goodies just to make things easier. So this video is just meant as a quick overview guide on using the brush pack. So I'm pretty sure you'll be able to use everything right out of the box, but it can be useful to see how some of the brushes were originally intended to be used as well. And there's a couple of quick tips in there along the way. But definitely do experiment. There's no right or wrong way to use them, and if it looks right, it is right. So yeah. First up, the inks. So these are a nice big selection of inkers you can use that cover your main lines, detailing, hatching, everything else. You can do entire illustrations with single brushes, so they're very versatile. So they're super easy to use, and it really is just a case of diving in, experimenting to find which ones actually work for the style that you like. So my own personal favourite is the one, top of the list. The reason for this is it's very versatile, it's very responsive, and you're able to do a lot with it without needing to change brushes, or without even needing to change brush size. So you can see it goes from a very thin to thick quite quickly. But even if you're working with a much larger brush size, you can still get that super thin at the start, building up to a much thicker one. So it means that when you are drawing, you can, kind of do a thicker outer line, a thinner line, and you can add in your hatching as well. And you don't need to touch a single thing. You don't need to change any settings. So that's one of the reasons I like it. So I would say this illustration, for example, the vast majority of that would have been inked with this, and even the flat blackouts would have been done with that too. Next up, the shaders. So these are a collection of markers and texture shaders and hard edges, soft edges, watercolors, all sorts of stuff. So these are really great for colouring in any of the images that you're working on. Probably the simplest one of the lot, one of the most basic brushes in the entire pack, is the blocker. So it might seem like it's silly to kind of include such a simple brush, but I will show you why it's in there. So this is a circle that's been drawn by one of the other brushes, one of the grit brushes, I think, and I will just draw a circle with the blocker. So obviously, if you can imagine, you're blocking in an area of colour that's a lot more complex shape than a circle, but this will prove the point. So if I want to just suddenly fill that in, it's absolutely perfect. Nice and smooth and even, but if I do that with a different brush, you can see that it's left with jaggy lines because Procreate doesn't know how to handle it. So yeah, so that's one of the tips. So with the blocker brush and also the cell color brush, you'll get 100% opaque brushes that will make it really easy for you to do that. Here's a sketch that I have inked and that I'm going to start to apply a bit of colour to. So that's the sketch and that's the ink. Now all I've done here is I've got 2 layers here, 8 and 9, and they're simply filled in with white where I want the colours to be. So 8 is the skin and 9 is where the clothing's going to be. So I've just got that as plain white. So I'm just going to, well, there's 2 ways you can do it. You can either alpha lock that layer by clicking on that, then alpha lock. That means that you can draw over that without going outside of the lines, which is very useful if you're like me. Or another way of doing it is to create another layer on top of that and then change it to clipping mask, and that will have the same effect with the bonus that you now have a layer on top of it. So it means that if you wanted to experiment with a texture overlay or something like that, and then you decide later you don't like it, you can easily turn it off or just delete it completely. So that's pretty useful. So I will just take something like the marker shader, for example. So now I'm able to go in and very quickly color in, and I really like this marker shader because it's easy to build up colour. So you've got a bit of texture within it as it is. And you can see it leaving loads of marks, but when you go over it again, it starts to build that up. So it's almost like a cheating way to be able to add in shadows and highlights onto your images. So that can be good. So it gives it quite a funky style, and it's very good for working with concept art styles and things like that. You can see there, just in the space of a couple of seconds, I've managed to go from just a flat, plain colour to something that's a little bit more interesting. Obviously you can take a bit more time and get something that's more complex, but that will give you a good idea of it. Okay, I am going to get rid of that, and I am going to create another layer with a clipping mask. I'm just going to fill that with one solid colour. Now I've got a base colour that I can work with. So I wanted to show you, let's start off with, let's say, the texture medium slow. So this is a different approach. It doesn't look as well, markery or jaggedy. It's just a nice way of creating a very, very smooth build-up of texture. This is one of my favourite brushes. So I'll just pick a slightly darker colour. So now as I'm drawing on it, it very, very slowly builds up. So it's like a kind of an instant gradient on any of the artwork. So it's a nice way of creating kind of more natural blends, so it doesn't look as kind of jagged as you might get with some of the markers or some of the cell brushes as well. So it can be good for different parts to be able to just make them look a little bit more realistic. Similarly, you could add in lighter colors as well, and where there might be kind of highlights. It's good for adding in backlights and things like that onto people. So yeah, so again, it doesn't take a whole lot of time to be able to quickly build something up that starts to make the illustration come to life and come off the page a little bit. That's another approach. With the cell shaders, I have they're a little bit of a shortcut. I'm just going to delete this, create a new layer, clip that, add in a skin tone across everything. So I'm going to create one more layer. This is going to be my shadows. So the cell colors are like a little bit of a shortcut. You don't have to worry about getting the shadow or the light colors absolutely perfect because it already has the settings done for you. So you can literally work with a black for the shadows or a white for the highlights. So I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to click onto the quick shadows. I'm going to set this to black. Make sure I'm in the right layer. So now when I start to draw on this, even though I'm drawing on black, it's taking the color that's underneath into account, and it's allowing the correct color to come through. So again, you can see in just a couple of strokes, it's starting to look three-dimensional. Similarly, I'll create one more layer for the highlights. Switch over to the quick cell highlights brush, and I'm going to work with the white on that. So even though it's white, it's not going to come out as white, it's going to come out as a light version of the colour that's underneath. So what's nice about this approach is that if you decide that whatever the colour is underneath, if you don't like that, if you decide to go back to that, let's say I'll go into my adjustments layer, I'll mess with my hue, saturation and brightness. So I can now go in and adjust that, and the shaded and the highlighted parts will automatically adapt to that. So that can be very useful. So if I decide I don't like that, or if I want to do something a bit more extreme, or create an alien rock chick, that's very easy to do without having to go and redo all of the shading all over again. Plus you've still got all the layers separated, so if you decide, oh, I didn't like the way I did that, you can very easily go back and redo it. So here is a more final version of it, where I'm going to show you how the Noise Magic brush works. I absolutely love this brush. It's great. It just kind of compresses the image, makes it warmer, and it just adds a little extra something to it. So you can work in whichever color you like, really, but just for this, I'm just going to use black now, just for a second. So again, it'll build up slowly. Now, I'm not being very careful for it. Normally I would make sure that all this is all clean, but it will give you an idea of the effects that adding this on. So, you know, I found that the guitar silhouette was a bit bland and boring, so with just a little bit of this thrown on top of it, it gives it that bit of noise. Now, within the brush name, it's got overlay and soft light. So they're two of the recommended layer modes that I suggest you use, just so that the effect isn't quite as harsh. So let's see, I'll go to a soft light, and that's really dampened it right down. So it's a lot more subtle, but it's most certainly there, and it absolutely adds a little bit of extra zip to the drawing. So I highly recommend that. And the last thing that I will show you, I'm going to create a new layer above everything else. We've got these overlay brushes at the end, and these work, they produce very similar effects to the canvases or the textures that you overlay on top of everything else. But the great thing with this is that they're all built in within the brushes, so you don't need to go looking for textures, importing them, adjusting them. They're all just set up, ready to go. So I'll click on this paper overlay, make my brush bigger, make sure I'm on the top layer. So I recommend doing this in just one single stroke, so you don't get any build up. And I will go and I'll change this load, this layer mode to multiply, and I'll play around with the opacity a little bit to kind of get it to the way I like it. So there you go, it's added in a little bit of texture to the overall thing, and again it makes it kind of hang together a little bit better. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to do it in black, you don't have to use the multiply mode, you can adjust it and tweak it to try to find a way that works out best for you. So it's not wrong if it looks right. One of the other types of shaders that we have are watercolor washes. So they behave very similarly to the real thing, in that you can apply a bit of paint on a page, and then as you move it around it'll start to blend it and blur it in with whatever else is there. So there's a few different types of ones. Again, experiment, see which ones you like. You can use these to colour in things, or for concept art, or just for light washes, but I tend to prefer to use it for backgrounds, just to make them a little bit more interesting. So for example, I can just very quickly just kind of paint in there, and you can see as I move the brush around it smudges it together. So it's not like using stamps where you've kind of got variations of the same thing over and over. You're able to go in and actually paint and create something that's unique every time you use it, which is very useful. So the stroke patterns. So these can be a lot of fun to use, and sometimes they can be a real time saver as well. So there's some similarities between these and the fill patterns, but the main difference is that the patterns change along with your brush size, and you can also use multiple strokes to add the patterns wherever you draw. So I'll take one of these for example. So okay, here's the dots one, which is very good for making very quick dotted lines. So if I change to a larger brush, you can see that changes with it. That will be a difference with the pattern based ones, and that the patterns, they stay the same size. That can be very useful. There's a couple of unique brushes in this as well. Right at the top we've got the halftone gradual and the stipple gradual. So these are pressure sensitive, so what that means is that if you are putting in a little bit of shading, if you start off very light, the dots will be smaller, but the harder you press down, the thicker they get. So the same goes for the stipple gradual as well, that you can start off with a very light and more sparser dots, and then the harder you press, the more dots come into it. So again, that can be an absolutely massive time saver when you're trying to add in stipple or halftone shading onto something. So the fill patterns, these are also an enormous time saver, and they let you add a lot of interesting effects and shading in just a few seconds. So the big difference in these and the stroke patterns is we've created nicely tiled patterns that you can add with your stroke. So this means that you can lift your brush up off the page and then come back and add more at a later time, and it'll match up absolutely perfectly. So let me just show you that. So I'll take the diagonal regular pattern. So as I draw on that, if I lift the brush off and I go to draw again, everything matches up nicely. One little trick for this, actually, for quadrupling the number of the fill patterns, is that if you actually draw and then rotate the canvas and then draw again, they'll overlay, and you can combine them to create a lot of interesting patterns. So that's pretty cool. So these patterns, they were designed to work together, a lot of the group stuff. So let's take the halftone light range. So if I was to put in some halftone and then go, you'll see that it's like halftone light, halftone regular, halftone bold. So if I go up to the regular one now, you'll see that those dots match perfectly and everything lines up nicely. Now I'll go up to an even heavier one. So it's another way of adding an interesting gradiated effect over things as well, and can kind of add a little bit of extra to the shading and make things like that a little bit more three-dimensional, which is very useful. So you'll probably notice that some of these fill patterns, especially the stipples, they're grouped by size. So you have the weights, where you have light, regular, busy, dense, but you have small at the end, so that's the size of it. So I've got small, medium and large. So the reason for this is if you're using a high resolution canvas and you draw a stipple on it, that's way too small, it's no use. So to save you from having to go and changing everything, any of the settings, you can just use one of the larger ones and that will just work straight away. So obviously if you do want to change any of these settings, it's very easy to do. All you do is click on the brush to open up the brush studio. You're going to go down to grain, you're going to look for a scale, and then you can change that to whatever you want it to be, whether it's larger or smaller. And don't ever worry about breaking the brush, you can't do that. But if you ever want to reset it back to the original setting, just go into about this brush and reset brush, hit reset, and that's it. Everything is back how it was, no harm. So I'll give you a quick example of this in effect. So I have a sketch that I've put on the ink outlines on. There's a small bit of hatching in there somewhere, but I just wanted a way to both shade this quickly and to also give it a nice retro aesthetic, I suppose. So I have blocked out the layer where the skin and the hair is, and without adding any color, I'm just going to use one of the patterns to add that three-dimensional quality to it. So I'm going to create a layer above my blocked out white skin area. I'm going to clip that, create a clipping mask so that whatever I draw is going to be nicely inside the lines. And I will pick, let's see, I'll try halftone bold large, see how that works out. So anywhere where there would typically be any shadows or a darker color, I'll just start to paint that in. So you can get nicer transitions going from, the black line, the proper black shadows to lighter skin tones and things like that. Now, I'm lazy, so I'm using quite a large brush size. So I will go back and clean up some of this now when I'm done. But very quickly you can see that there is a lot of depth suddenly gone into that image. So yeah, so I'll go back and just tidy this up with one of the erasers. Very quickly, we've suddenly gone from a very flat looking image to something that's just a little bit more interesting. So yeah, so obviously you can continue to add color, or you can add more of the fill patterns. Just it depends on how you want to shade this and what sort of aesthetic you want. Onto the bonus toolbox. So this is a collection. They're all very simple brushes, but it's just very useful to be able to just go and grab them whenever you need them, instead of having to go search through different brush packs or create new brushes. What have we got in here? So there's several sketchers. These are pretty much pencils. They all behave in a similar way in that you can go from pressure sensitive, you can go from a very light touch to something much darker, and they all have tilt so that you can shade as well. So they're very nice for sketching with. My own favourite is the gritty one, but you might prefer one of the other ones. We've got several of the smudge brushes, which I'll show you now in 1 second. And also we've got 6 erasers. It might seem like overkill to have that many, but to be honest, every time I don't think I've ever done an illustration where I haven't needed at least 2 or 3 different types of erasers, just to either get a very instant hard edge or to get something that's a little bit softer. So it's good to have these already made and there and good to go, so that you can just use them whenever you need them. So finally, I'll give you a quick look at some of the smudgers as well. So to use those, you just click on the smudge tool icon and then just choose one of them and smudge away. So I'll give you a quick example. Let's see. I am going to take just the basic blocker. I'm going to work on the skin layer and I'll choose a slightly darker color. Add in very, very roughly a little bit of shadow where that might appear. Also add in some lighter highlights where there might be a bit of reflection. Okay, looks terrible, good stuff. Okay, so let's take one of the smudger ones, and I am going to use, where are we, Toolbox, and I'll use the smooth smudger. So now I can go in and I can start to blend those together. Obviously the size and the opacity that you use the brush at will determine how it's all going to blend together. But you know, I'll keep a slightly harder line towards the top, and I want this to blend in a lot more. Same with down here. You can just see the colours are starting to fade in a little bit more, make it look a bit more three-dimensional. So again, I'm doing this very, very quickly, but you'll get the idea of how quick and easy it is to actually use these to start to put together something that went from looking incredibly flat to a lot more three-dimensional in a very, very quick time. Well, obviously you can go back and paint over any of these bits and fix anything that might need fixing, but you get the idea anyway. So it's very, very quick to be able to build up contours and texture using something like that, and the smudge brush is great for being able to gloss over just the simple colour blocks. So finally, the bonus textures, and these are a really nice and easy way to just give your illustration that nice little bit of a finishing touch, and it's very, very quick, very easy to do. So we've included a texture pack which you just need to unzip and save somewhere that you can access it. So I'm just going to go into the layers panel, make sure I'm at the top layer. I'm going to go into the actions menu, click on add, insert a file, browse to where I have everything saved. I'm going to use the green room paper texture. And I'll just zoom out a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. Extend that so it covers everything. Now if I go back into the layers panel, on that layer I've just inserted, I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. So already, hopefully you'll be able to see that that's made a big difference to it, and it just gives it a little bit more warmth and makes it look like it was inked on paper, which is always good. So obviously you can go and adjust the opacity and make the effect as prominent or as light as you like. And you know, there's no right or wrong way to use the textures and in selecting the blend mode. So it's worth experimenting and see what looks funky to you. So you could take this another little step as well and duplicate that layer. And I'm going to change the blend mode of this to something like screen, so that makes sure that it catches all of the blacks in it as well. And now if I reduce down the opacity of that, that will catch even more of it. So it's a nice way of making it look that little bit more realistic as well, because it like usually you don't see black in the real world. So if you have something that's just a slightly faded black, it can make it look like it's a little bit more authentically inky. So yeah, so there you have it.